Welcome to Environment Long Island. I'm Karl Grossman with John Bouvier, who has been a Southampton Town Councilman for 8 years, and now he's term limited. We're recording the show at the sort of the end of 2023, and before John leaves the town council stage, he's been a great environmentalist on the town board. Previously, he was on with the Conservation Board in Southampton. And furthermore, his background is utterly amazing for a local official involved with NASA and the space station and on and on. And you raised originally as a young kid in Remsenburg. That's near West Hampton,
Yes.
but spent a lot of time as a young man in Europe, and then came back here, and West Hampton was,
I came back here for 6 months of high school, and went to high school. So that was my reintegration to the United States. I just spent many years moving from country to country in Europe, and I was really fortunate, just to have that life. I could learn languages, and I saw many cultures, different cultures, and it just changed my perspective on things. And when I came back to the United States, it was a bit of a culture shock for me. It took me a little while to adjust, yeah. So here I am.
and I've always wondered, Bouvier, any relationship to Jacqueline Bouvier and John Kennedy and so forth, and I had the chance just before we went on the air to ask John, is there a connection?
And there is, yes. Jackie was my cousin and my godmother as well. And so I remember being in East Hampton, and I think we had lunch a few times. In East Hampton, we have a family burial ground as well. And so we would spend some time there. I didn't have a lot of contact with her, but the contact I did was really wonderful. And she and my father grew up together in East Hampton, so that she always followed him. They were always talking all the times. For all that I remember, if he was sitting in his office, he was talking with her, and she was talking with him. And when my father fell ill, Jackie, was there, and so yeah, she's a big part of my family memory that I really loved. Loved her.
And President Kennedy you connected with?
I did. When we were in Europe, Jackie and John came to visit in Europe, and that was the first time I'd ever seen him. And he was very impressive, as you had said. He's sort of film star kind of look, but extremely intelligent and very responsive. Later on in my life, I met politicians, and I was young, but he looked at you, and it wasn't an act, and that's what I remember as a young child. That he was very. There was a lot of rapport there.
What I was reflecting before we started filming was seeing him. I was a copy boy in Cleveland, and he made a campaign appearance in 1960. And he looked like a movie star, tanned and
Yeah.
extraordinarily handsome. Not to mention when he became president, so well spoken, and what a humorous touch he had too, which is
Yes, yeah, and it was a love story in many ways, ups and downs, but Jackie was absolutely in love with her husband. That's what I remember. That's the way I'm going to remember it. Let's put it that way.
now so this is what I'm looking at, biography. You talk about West Hampton. That's why I mentioned West Hampton. And as a child in West Hampton, I remember our bay and beach quality quite differently than it is today, and that is what motivated me to seek public office. How did it motivate you?
Well, I grew up watching Jacques Cousteau, so I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau, and I would spend a lot of my time in the water. So even as a 5-year-old in Remsenburg, where we lived on Shore Road, so down at the end of that road, I would go. I had my mask and my My little wetsuit and fins and flippers, and my mother would escort me down there, and I'd go explore. And I remembered the bay bottom that the way I'd seen it as a young child. And then later, when I moved back here, when I was in my late teens, I came back and started to explore the same places I'd explored as a 5-year-old, and it was unrecognizable. The bay bottoms are different. And I had a moment with my daughter when I took her. I told her, "Well, we're going to go out, and I'm going to show you, where I got interested in being underwater and working with submarines and things like that. This is why and how I got." And brought her out, and I built it all up because out of my memory. And when she went over the side, 5 minutes later, she comes back up. We were using tanks, and she comes back up and just looks at me, and that's the moment I lost my daughter's credibility, because I had told her what I'd seen, and it wasn't there. And that's an horrific thing to experience over your own lifetime, to see this unbelievable change in the bay bottom. I remember stripers coming through Moriches Inlet, and crabs dancing, and fish everywhere, and seagrass everywhere, and all of that was gone. All the oysters were gone. It was very, very impactful to me, and I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to do something in public service, try to make that change.
And 8 years on the town board, 2 years on the conservation board. What did you try to do? What could be done? What did you do?
Well, I sit on the management committee for the Peconic Estuary Partnership. So work with the interconnection between government and science, and being able to get the funds necessary to do the things that need to be done. Here in Southampton, we introduce IA systems, and we mandate the installation of those, because nitrogen is one of the larger contributors of part of the problem.
And IA is innovative
Alternative systems, so
Okay.
septic systems.
Right.
So instead of taking all the nitrogen that we produce and just putting it into the aquifer, which then ultimately leads to the bays, we want to cut that off, and that's the intent of that program. So we're in the third or fifth, or maybe fourth or fifth year now. We've got thousands installed. I know East Hampton is really working hard as well. Most of the East End recognizes the need for that. But if you understand that water moves under us at a tremendous, at a very slow rate, so a toilet that was flushed 50 years ago in the middle of the island, that water is just making its way to the bay. So we have a lot of stuff upstream that's still in our aquifer that we need to deal with. And IA systems are one way to do that. The other way is behavior, regulating the kind of chemicals and how fertilizing and all those sorts of things are important. So I've been part of that with Legislator Fleming, trying to work on those things. It's multifaceted and requires years of vision to envision what you're trying to achieve at the end of it.
Energy has also been a focus.
Energy has, because the climate change problem that we have is largely driven by CO2, and we need to get those emissions down. And they're largely about 65% come from commercial and residential, and those are the emissions through fossil fuel driven motors, engines, heating, all that kind of stuff. And there are reliable alternatives to that, and those are now becoming more mainstream in production. But that's what we're trying to do, is get the emissions down by reducing the dependence on fossil fuels. That's the real drive. And we just the other day, we've offered up a climate action plan, which is a guideline, a roadmap on what the town can do to find the low-hanging fruit where the emissions are high, to reduce those emissions, and how to do that. And it's a plan to put forward, to go forward with.
The main component of the plan.
Well, it's touches on everything. It's where does the town emit a lot of CO2? So we decided to use Town Hall as a model. you know, show what you can do and show what people can do in order to reduce the carbon emissions. So I'm really proud we put a first solar plant panel on a town building when I first got into office, and we've changed the way we heat town hall, and we're going on. Town hall is going just about ready to go on to a full set of IA septic systems. That kind of model for people to see, that this is what can be done. And the climate action plan contains all of that for relative to building, relative to where and how you can reduce your emissions from in your residence to reducing fossil fuel, you know, reducing your dependence on fossil fuels. We've installed first solar array in Southampton and North Sea, and set up a system where people can use that power locally, and then we can set up a star system like we do with heating homes, where people of lower income or fixed income can benefit from that, and we can pass those savings on to other people. You know, despite the idea that most people have about the Hamptons, that it's this very rich community. Well, it is, but it's also have people that work hard and are moderate income and fixed income, and should not bear an unequal burden in that respect to get these things done. So.
And the solar array, that's at the North Sea landfill site?
Yep, yeah, it's built over the landfill. I think we're gonna start building probably first quarter next year, so I'm excited about that. And we've identified a number of areas throughout the town of Southampton where these solar panels, solar arrays are usable, and how we can, the problem we have with the grid is that the grid is so saturated already, it's very hard to find places to actually interconnect. So when we produce that power, we need to interconnect with that. So we have to work with PSEG and LIPA. And you know, LIPA's had there's a commission right now looking at LIPA, and we've testified for that on how to make that better, but also how to make an investment in the grid so that the grid is more renewable energy friendly, which brings up the battery issue. You know, we don't want to store energy like that in residences or near residences and things like that. We want to store them in other places, but we have nowhere to plug into. So part of that is to, you know, fix the grid basically. You know, for many years this grid has not been updated, and yet we're paying the fourth highest price per kilowatt hour in the United States here in Southampton.
Yeah, and
long-winded, I know, I apologize.
no, and the study was is to expand LIPA, make it a fully public utility, and not just have PSEG run the grid, but LIPA itself.
Yeah, well, it's unique in the United States. It's sort of public-private, and it's a unique model, and it's not, in my opinion, does not work well with organizations like PSEG, where it's a weird kind of arrangement, and it doesn't seem to function that well relative to setting priorities, and particularly on issues relative to climate change. But also, you know, you know, as a point in reference, we have National Grid, I think, is just petitioned the PSC for an increase in their pricing. Now, that's a fossil fuel. You know, what happened then is that they're estimating that the average bill is going to go up by $28 as a result of that request if the PSC grants it. So you're already starting to see utilities and power authorities being affected by this price change, particularly everything's happening in the Middle East and in Ukraine. The price of fossil fuel driven power is going up, but the price of renewable energy products is going down. So it makes perfect sense to try to do this, but it takes time for people to understand and to get governments working together. I've been very fortunate in office because we've had Bridget Fleming and Legislator Fleming and Assemblyman Thiel, and we've had this really great relationship, and that type of relationship allows us to do more, I think, than if you're sort of politically bound.
Speaking of finances, the cost of housing,
Yeah.
well, all over Long Island, but particularly on eastern Long Island and the east end. I mean, it's sky high. Young people from here can't afford, unless they inherit their parents' place. And you've been very active on the housing issue too.
I have. I think the greatest accomplishment, again, this is the same idea, working with another government, Assemblyman Thiel, put in legislation that was passed that allows us to form a community housing fund, so that we'll have dedicated funding to be able to offset some of that. But it also gets back to the sustainability issue, that we can build homes that are not only affordable, but also efficient, and they're efficient, and their efficiency makes them affordable as well. So all these things work together. And it's been hard, because you have, people say, I love affordable housing, I totally get it, I think it's, but not near me, that kind of attitude. And we did Spion Commons, which, had a lot of people at first against it, but now the residents in the area are very proud of it. It's a wonderful area, and the idea was to provide housing across the town, share the load, not big brick apartments, complexes and things like that, but houses and that were it can be aesthetically integrated with the communities, and so I think that's a good model to go forward with.
Now let's jump from the Earth on the East End to space and NASA and your whole long career involving very exotic kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, it's a long road. It's where, as I mentioned earlier, it started out with Jacques Cousteau, and I ended up going to California and working at deep ocean engineering while I was going to college. And I worked with Sylvia Earle and a guy named Graham Hawkes, who taught me everything about robotics. And we designed submersible robotics, and also designed a submersible called Deep Rover, and a submersible called Rig Rover, which was used on, that's where actually I was impacted by when I worked as a commercial diver in oil fields, in order to make money to go to school. That's what I did. And I traveled all over the place, but I also saw how that industry works. So that kind of shaped my mind as well. But then I ended up coming back here, and I went to work at the Naval Weapons Lab in Calverton for Grumman, the Grumman Space Station Support Division. And my robotics background, they ended up asking me to go to Washington for that initiative, which was to look and examine all the robotic systems, the MSS, and all the different systems, robotic systems on the space station. And at that time, I was approached by Oceaneering, because I'd been a diver. It's a big diving company. And they asked me to form Oceaneering Space Systems, which is a division of Oceaneering. And we got a contract to teach astronauts how to work using robotics, but also work in space, because it's very similar to the work that we would do underwater. We're neutrally buoyant, and we learned a lot of things and taught a lot of things and worked with the neutral buoyancy folks. And it was just, I thought everybody had that life, and I was just living the life, because it was pursuing the things that really motivated me, that interested me. And I've been able to, up until now, apply that. So it was exciting to me.
And the connection between diving and robotics and diving, maybe we should define too how robotics applies to diving, and the connection between diving and robotics and astronauts on the space station. How does that
Well,
fit together?
if you can imagine a spacesuit that astronauts wear, it's very similar to high-pressure suits that we make to work deep in the ocean. If you're inside a vehicle underwater, a small submarine, you need to have hands, but you don't. So you use a joystick to control arms that are outside of the submarine to do work, to inspect, to change things, to work on blowout preventers, and look at the risers and things, particularly in the oil industry. It's the same thing in space. An astronaut, he only has his hands, but these suits are rigid, because they're actually at a lower pressure than you would be in underwater, we have high pressure. In space, there's no pressure. So you have to protect against a suit from it expanding in space and contracting underwater because of the differential, the pressure differential.
And in terms of what you were involved in terms of applying to space, could you describe?
Yeah, well, I mean, all the things that we learned underwater, the use of robotics, but also the methodology of working in a zero gravity environment that's underwater is simulated by, you're just floating underwater. In space, you're in zero gravity. It's pretty much the same kind of environment. So that's what our expertise, we were asked to write something called the Robotic Systems Integration Standards, which we did as a team, and we got recognized by NASA for that. And that this would laid out what astronauts should do and can do, the types of tools they need to use, what they need to do based on the experience that we as divers had learned working underwater as in very similar situations. Just the parallels were very close in that respect.
It's interesting, I've, as a journalist, have written a lot and done television a lot on NASA, but I've never really knew about the connection between underwater work and working in space.
Well, it was, we kind of drove it because, we thought, hey, this is a good idea. And Story Musgrave was one of the astronauts. We worked for Fred Hayes, who was the Apollo 13 crew member. And they recognized, that's it. If you think about it, astronauts train in a neutral buoyancy lab, which is basically a big swimming pool. And underwater, you learn how to do all the things that you're going to do. You train to do those in space. And there's methodologies that we learned as divers through our experience over many, many years that we were able to give to the astronaut corps in order for them to do work, and taught them and trained them in the neutral buoyancy labs, but also, in the use of robotics and so forth. So kind of interesting. In space, you have a different issue. You have gravity waves, and you have some issues with controlling robotic arms. Underwater, we have the same kind of issues. We have pressure differentials. We designed seawater hydraulic systems to do that, but they got stronger as you went deeper. The robot got stronger as you went deeper. But there's a lot of parallels. I mean, we could go on for hours, but the parallels between space and working underwater are very similar.
Well, what extraordinary background you have for a person who ultimately becomes, or in recent years, the last decade, a Long Island public official. Back to Long Island, back to...
I was just really lucky. I've been very lucky in my life, and I feel blessed for that. But thanks for the comment.
Well, it's an amazing background. And back to Long Island and the deterioration of the environment through the years, particularly the marine environment, but it's more than that. Are you hopeful? I mean, you've now spent 10 years tackling these issues. How do you feel about the future?
I actually feel very good about it, because when I first ran, I would knock on doors and talk about water quality and eyes would glaze over, and it wasn't the main topic of conversation. Now everybody recognizes it. I think there are very few people that can't deny that we're facing an existential moment in our environmental history. Certainly, I think the U.S. government just reached out and said, this is probably the last generation that will be able to do something about this issue, and it's full of young, enthusiastic people who recognize the need and are strong-willed and understand that they're going to inherit something terrible if they don't do something now. So I'm hopeful in that respect.
And we're focused here on climate change or global warming.
Well, yes, exactly, yeah.
And for those, and there's some in politics who deny global warming, who deny climate change is happening. What's your feeling about them?
Well, I'm sorry that they don't see that or deny it. It's not, you can deny something is true intentionally, so I don't know how that works, but the reality is that signs are all over. Everywhere you look, this is happening, and we're a coastal community, so we're sort of a barometer for what the environment is going to become. And we're already seeing sea level rise. We're seeing saltwater intrusion along our coast. We're seeing the effects that we talked about earlier, that we have no eelgrass left. We have, you know, the environment underwater is totally changed. Farmers are seeing that there's an impact on climate change, particularly CO2 and plant evolution and how they grow fruits and vegetables. And the Department of Agriculture did a really strong report on the effects of climate change on that, particularly CO2 on photosynthesis, plant growth, and all that kind of thing. So.
We've been hearing from John Bouvier, who is a living example of, I think, the problems with term limits. I think for you to have to leave public life after 10 years, but maybe you don't have to leave public life. Maybe there's, I mean, the notion is to bring in new blood but people in public life who are so brilliant and have such institutional history, and in your situation, environmental knowledge is a mistake. John, thank you so much for being with us on Environment Long Island. I'm Karl Grossman, and thank you for watching.